Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining wherever you are in USA, London, Cambridge, Beijing, or anywhere else. Thank you very much for coming to this talk. RASBJ is very lucky and proud to be able to present a talk between Hans van der Ven and David Rennie about Hans's new book, Blood Dawn, which I cannot recommend too highly. It's a gripping account of how World War II in Asia changed world history. Just a quick note before we start, please post any questions you have in the chat function addressed to everyone, where the moderator, David Rennie, will pick them up, or we will help. So I think we're ready to start, if that's all right. So David, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. It's a great pleasure and great to be back talking to the RASBJ membership. I have fond memories. I'm talking to you from the Economist offices in London, and a real honour to be hearing from Professor van der Ven about his really excellent book. And he's one of the great distinguished historians of China at Cambridge University, and has written this really important book that I think is not just a kind of a corrective for a lot of the sort of the very Eurocentric accounts of history that we have for World War II, but also, and we'll get to this later on in the conversation, has some really important observations about kind of questions that arise out of how Asia perceives this, how Asia lived this, that are really relevant in the modern day. So it's one of those kind of excellent works of history that we need to be reading to understand today's world, and to understand where we perhaps are prisoners of our own assumptions. And I think it's really fantastic. And it's really interesting to see you make a note towards the end of the book that literally just languages makes a difference. And I'm sure this resonates with a lot of the people on this call, who I'm sure have many languages between them. But the fact that you had Dutch as well as English meant that you could go deeply into the archives of the Dutch East Indies, and also your exquisite kind of Chinese skills. Again, you could go deeply into the kind of source materials. And so I think in a world where we're all wondering whether AI is going to make all of our kind of learning irrelevant, I, for one, am delighted to see someone making use of good old-fashioned archival language skills. And so I'd love to ask you really to sort of, for the audience, before I get to questions that I'm keen to put to you, could you just give us a very brief sort of elevator pitch of what this book is about? If you bumped into someone in a bookshop and you saw them hovering near the non-fiction bestseller shelf, why should they take your book off the shelf?
Right, thank you. Thank you, first of all, David, for chairing this discussion, and of course also to Alan and Melinda for organizing it, and to all of you for being here. It's an absolute delight. In terms of so one of the things you just said really resonated with me, and we'll talk about it later, but there is something, I think there's something dangerous about Anglo-parochialism, and you see it more and more, and I see it in my Chinese students, actually, the ones that I teach at Peking University. We can talk about that later. But what is the book about? Well, it is coverage of Asia during the Second World War, which I date from 1937, so the beginning of Japan's invasion of China south of the Great Wall, until the Bandung Conference. And the one reason I do so is because I really don't think that Japan's surrender in 1945, August 1945, was all that much of a turning point. Yes, it was a turning point. Japan had to cease its operations. But across Asia, the fighting continued, and nobody can really prove this, I think. But whenever I say that the number of people who died or starved to death between 1945 and 1955 was probably larger than between 1937 and 1945. That's right. And so you have this continuing violence, and so Japan's surrender was important, but it didn't solve the issues that were at play in Asia in the Second World War. So I gave this a somewhat bigger framework by saying, well, to understand what was happening in Asia, you have to go back to the early 19th century, when first Britain and the Dutch, then later joined by the French and the Japanese and the Americans, sort of created these territorial colonies, and all the established monarchies, empires, all were finished around 1900, and China was the last one in 1912. In the late 19th century, of the emergence of still very lacking substantive power, sort of independence movements, rebellions against the European colonialism. And these are then really activated in the Second World War. They see their chances to use the violence, the mayhem, the discord, sort of the global geopolitical order collapsing. They see these opportunities to assert the kinds of, to create the movements, the campaigns, the armies that will then allow them to reshape their societies and put them on an entirely different course. So I really see this long Second World War as an actual moment out of which Asia today emerged. And I think the remembering of the Second World War, these provide the origin stories of the nation states that now make up Asia. And I think that sense of they have a stronger hold on the imagination than the Second World War does in Europe, especially among younger generation. But the second reason I decided to go, I've written a lot about China during the Second World War. But I decided that actually to really understand the Second World War, you need to have an Asian framing. And that's partly because, of course, Japan was an empire. And I think we can do a lot more still about how Japan conceived of its empire, how they tried to remake the whole Asia in terms of its own empire. I mean, just examples, they thought of Shanghai, but after they took all of Shanghai after 1941 as a nodal point in between Southeast Asia and Japan itself. Of course, that doesn't work in the end, and they change their strategies again. But sort of this idea of Japanese government, Japanese military, actively thinking about how are we going to build this empire, I think is a really interesting question, and it demands an Asian framework of thinking about it. But also, Chiang Kai-shek was highly aware of what was happening in Asia and globally. And so were people like Nehru and Gandhi in India, or Sukarno and Hatta and Sudan Shahrir. And sort of all these things were interconnected. And I think we often forget that the Second World War in Asia really began after a collapse of United Front movements. Of course, the one in China is very famous, but it was intimately linked to Popular Front governments in France as well as in Spain. And then people give up. So these are sort of Asian linkages, but actually even global linkages. So to get to a real global understanding of the Second World War, we need to have that Asian perspective, which essentially means, yes, we will fight for our freedoms. We will fight Japan, but we also will fight Europeans. And I think that's one way of moving beyond. It's needed to move beyond a very Eurocentric framework. And I sort of was really pushed to do this because of Brexit, when in Britain at least, the memories of the Second World War, and of course especially Churchill, were so mobilized for a very limited, for Brexit, and I think it was a very limited understanding of the Second World War. And that sort of is a broader point I'm trying to make, is that in thinking about the Second World War, sort of we need to refresh our understandings of it so that we can learn proper lessons from it that are not quite so confined. Sort of, I think our commemorations of the Second World War have become so solid, so unchallengeable. I thought, but by emphasizing the very different Asian perspective on this, that might actually be helpful in us as we face a world that is once again in great disorder. We don't know where it's going. Of course, your job is to guide us through that. But I think it's helpful to sort of rethink what this was all about.
Fantastic. So you've actually, it's one of the few sort of positive things out of Brexit. So clearly it was so annoying being a Dutchman living in Cambridge, watching advertisements with Spitfires and the White Cliffs at Dover, that you were moved to write this very brilliant book. So to sort of set the scene for people online, you make this very good point that the standard narrative, certainly, where I am sitting here in London, is that World War II is from 1939 to 1945, but really D-Day in 1944 is the kind of the book stop. And it's Churchill, and it's the Battle of Britain, and it's D-Day, and then the fall of Berlin, and it's a fundamentally Anglophone story with kind of walk-on parts for the Soviet Union, the French and others. And it's about sort of a heroic fight against freedom. But very early on in the book, you make this really kind of brilliant observation that sort of took me by surprise, that from the Asian standpoint, World War II actually looks like the European experience of World War I, by which you mean, if you're a European, certainly on the continent of Europe, World War I was the war that ended three empires,
right?
The Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Romanov Empire in Russia, and then gave birth to lots and lots of new nation states around, East and Southern Europe and in the Middle East, and that was the experience that Asia had of World War II. Help us understand what you mean by that.
Right. So, as you say, at the time of the First World War, you have three empires that disintegrate, and you get a new Europe emerging out of that, a Europe of serious nation states, strong nation states. And of course, at the time, that was not the case in Asia. The structures of empire remained very strong. And so one of the interesting things I found in writing this book is to compare different sorts of empire. But when we write about empire, we usually have the British Empire in mind, but there are great distinctions between the British and the Dutch Empire. And so one of the questions I ask my students in China is sort of which country was not one of the 8 countries that invaded China in 1900 during the Boxer Uprising. And of course, it's the Netherlands. And the Netherlands decided that the British is a very militarized empire. It's a militarized empire because it has the Royal Navy. It needs to get the policemen of Asia. And the Dutch say, fine, we're not a world power, but we'll have our colony and we'll just become very, very rich. And that's fine by us. And then they don't join the partition of Africa, and they don't join the invasion of China. But sort of during the Second World War, this Asia as control, where empires, interlocking empires, are really in control, that collapses. And then out of it, you get an Asia that is made up of China, of Japan, whose territories are then confined, of ultimately Vietnam, of the Philippines, of Indonesia, and of India, Pakistan, Burma, and Thailand. I think one of the interesting things that has always been really in my mind was, why is it that these Asian countries decided to become large centralized states? Centralized states. Because in so many ways, there's nothing natural about Indonesia or even India, or in many ways, China, which I think is a far more fragmented policy than we tend to think. And I think the two reasons for that, which just, again, illustrates the significance of the Second World War in shaping these outcomes, is that on the one hand, they associated imperialism with divide and rule tactics, and so they don't want to do that. They don't want to go back there. But I also think there's a real sense of, well, how do we regain our agency, our strength in the world? And for that, obviously, you need to be a centralized polity. And I think in this development of these new, and so you do get China as a large country, India as a large country, and Indonesia as a large country, although we often don't think about Indonesia very much, but that might well change in the future. And so I found those questions very interesting, and you can see there's a lot of contingency there. Sukarno's idea of the future of Indonesia was one with then Malaya, Malaysia, and Singapore, part of it. He even thought about parts of the Philippines, probably. And then it's in a lot of negotiations back and forth within people in Indonesia itself, but also with the Japanese, and of course later with the Allies, some kind of new Indonesia is defined. And I think the same is true for Pakistan, India, where what is, yes, we want a large state, and we want modern nation states, and all of that, and we want the sovereignty model, but precisely what that is going to mean remains in the case of India in not just until partition in 1947, when you get a division of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan, But within India itself, the debates about what kind of India we're going to become, less constitutional debates. And I think in China too, and I heard this from one of Yang Kwei-sung. He once told me, as one of the foremost historians of the Chinese Communist Party, I once talked with him about this question. Why, Mao Zedong in many ways is a natural decentralizer. In today's language, he would be a natural Burnham-esque kind of figure, willing to sort of fragment. And that's, his early writings in the 1920s are all about that kind of thing. I said, well, he had a discussion with Stalin and said, if you can possibly help it, please unify your country, have a central government that makes it much more easy to deal with all these minorities. And the consequences, of course, we see today. But this is true or not, I don't know. It's just
so let's break it down into stages, because I think this is such an interesting point you're making about the role of nationalism. This is one of the big surprises of your book. So you talk about the 19th century, where the kind of prowling, predatory Western powers, the British, the French, the Portuguese in some cases, they had that model where they were kind of clinging to the very edge of countries like China. They had the treaty ports. They didn't have access to the interior. And then in many cases, certainly the Dutch in, say, the Dutch East Indies, over the course of the 19th century, they actually turned them into kind of formal colonies. Now, obviously, that didn't happen to China. There was a kind of different hybrid model with a weak Chinese empire kind of basically, under the tutelage increasingly of the colonial powers. But you say that process of creating these kind of territorially defined colonies, that sense of subordination, ultimately fueled the kind of nationalism that broke out in World War II in places like Indonesia to say, enough of the Dutch, we want to be free of the Dutch. But I think you also place quite a lot of that blame on, why did Japan turn into this very aggressive, militaristic kind of player? It was that Japan was learning quite dark lessons from its European imperial rivals, and that to some extent it was copying that kind of European kind of imperial mindset. It helps us understand. So, we'll do it in the 19th century, and then we'll look at kind of the between the wars, First World War, Second War, and then we'll get to the Second World War. So, just help us understand the extent to which I think you put quite a lot of blame on the Western powers for kind of leading up to the elements of Japanese militarism and the aggression of Japan from kind of the start of the 20th century.
There's a whole lot there. We'll try to unpack things one by one, really. I think the first thing to say is that I don't think it at all was inevitable that Japan would become this violent, brutal, militaristic empire. I think I point out in the book there were real moments when Japan could have gone a very different way, especially in the 1920s, when you have something called Taisho democracy. The military is put in its place, and regular people, regular politicians take over the government. So I don't think it is something that sometimes argued that Japan at the time was instinctively militaristic, and I don't really buy that. It's much more, any culture is more complicated than that, so you don't have to buy that. And in many ways, I think the Japanese empire was highly opportunistic. It expands when the opportunities are there to do so. First, of course, in China, and then the US and the UK are busy with, the US is isolationist, and the UK is very busy with affairs in Europe, so new opportunities arrive. And I think economic questions really are very fundamental to understanding Japanese expansionism. In terms of sort of this aggressive European imperialism, again, I think there are differences, right? I mean, the UK is highly territorially instinctive. I think the Dutch are different in their approach to empire. They leave local aristocracies in place. They don't go for direct taxation. I mean, they're aggressive in other ways. There's a lot of fighting. The conquest of India is a very violent one. It's like a Napoleonic exercise. Napoleon fails, but Britain succeeds in the subcontinent. And I think it's this idea of a global competition for great power status, in which acquiring more and more resources, and this Darwinian sense of the struggle for the survival of the fittest that really drives that. But in the late 19th century, In India, in Indonesia, and of course in China, you have these elites that are beginning to respond to that. They don't like their lack of the loss of agency. They don't like it that their countries are becoming poor, looked down upon, disdained. This is not what they begin to really think about sort of what is it that we need to do to revive ourselves politically, economically, to become, the Chinese everywhere.
And you make this fascinating distinction in the book about that late 19th century nationalism.
Yeah.
Was very often an elite intellectual nationalism. It was people like, Lu Xun and Liang Qichao sitting in kind of tea houses in Tokyo, studying Japanese translations of German books on nationalism.
Exactly.
But as long as it was at that elite level, that was always going to limit its political power.
That's
then to move to kind of the post-World War I, because clearly World War I was fundamentally not an Asian war. Japan was on the side of the Allies, but it was not an Asian war. And I guess for certainly people sitting in China, the thing that everyone talks about, remembers, dwells on, was the Versailles Peace Conference in Paris, and the way that Japan ended up still retaining, parts of China that used to belong to the German Empire, and the delegation from China, signed such a weak deal at Versailles that you had the kind of the May 4th movements and the protests against this humiliation. So then nationalism becomes a kind of popular cause. Yes. And you also make this really fascinating point that if we're looking for distinctions between Europe and Asia, that because of the absolute bloodbath of the kind of the ruling elites and their sons in the battles of the fields of Flanders and the trenches of France, the World War I for Europeans discredited nationalism.
That's right.
There was an entire generation, certainly of kind of the ruling elites, who had lost their sort of sons to this war.
Yeah.
But in Asia, it was very different. Nationalism was strengthened by World War I, and what came out of that sense that Europe had bullied and humiliated so many countries in Asia, including Japan. The Japanese delegate to Versailles felt that there was a kind of racial discrimination directed at Japan that was intolerable. So help us understand this moment. It's 1919.
Right.
Europeans and the Americans under Woodrow Wilson in despair about the horrors of nationalism. But in your telling, Asians are drawing very, very different lessons.
They are different. Yeah. And just to make that point, I mean, it's the May 4th, of course, has an Asian context. The same thing happens, the same protests happen in Korea, where it actually begins, and then it goes into China, and then it goes into Egypt as well as India. You get these massive protests. One thing that, and it is not just Versailles, but it's also the October Revolution. And it is also the decision
in Russia, the 1917.
Yeah. So the spread of communism. So I think you get the spread of nationalism and sort of freedom, self-determination, but also communism, and also actually Islam, which I think is actually I had not thought about before beginning this book. You have the sort of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of Turkey as a nationalist state that really influenced Islamic populations across Southeast Asia, and I suspect also in China, although we're not allowed to know about that. And I think in what these demonstrations showed is not just this kind of nationalism, self-determination, even revolution, but also the power of mass movements. And by then, of course, you have new media. I think new media is very important in this story. Lots of journals, lots of magazines. You also actually get the beginning of the radio, and Sun Yat-sen is the first who makes use of the radio in China to create a nationalist message. In Shanghai, as it happens, speaking from the rooftops of, I think, the great World Center. And then you get these, and one of the consequences of the First World War in Europe is that the foreigners who have been left behind, have been ordered not to come to Europe in order to maintain empire in China and in India, they become more militaristic. And that's one of the reasons you get these massacres in Shanghai and in Guangzhou, because they want to show that they too can fight. And of course, that splits the Chinese against the foreigners even more strongly than it already had been. And then you get various people trying to mobilize this new source of power, which had been shown, of course, in Russia in the October Revolution, but also in the May 4th-like movements across Asia. So we can do something with that. We can mobilize it. And then people begin to organize parties. The nationalists and the communists in China, but the Congress Party, it's a longer history, but then under Gandhi especially begins to build a mass movement. Sukarno does the same in Indonesia. But of course, the problem is they're all improvising and they don't quite know how to do it. They reach for various models. And in the process, they split between nationalists and communists. I think for the longest time, very few Chinese would have known precisely what is the difference between a member of the KMT and the CCP. Mm. But by 1928, it's clear, and it's not, it's going to be very disruptive. And I think to focus on that helps us explain the kinds of civil wars that emerge after 1945, as these various parties, have gained even more power and more greater social base, have built up their own armies, have built up their mass organizations, and then they begin fighting for the future of their countries from,
But to pick up on your point, your fascinating comparison of kind of, someone like, Lu Xun publishing journals, for intellectuals, that this was the kind of the TikTok of its day, right? That this was the,
exactly.
The radio broadcasts. And you make this point, I mean, this is not exactly how you frame it, but, you could imagine being a kind of a young, disenchanted British student who immediately after World War I, for you, nationalism is a kind of an old man in a general's uniform sending young men to die. And so nationalism is this kind of awful, old, kind of dying imperial kind of creed. And literally the Austro-Hungarian Empire is, being swept into the dustbin of history. But you have this phrase about how nationalism in Asia, if you're looking at, say, the 1920s, the 1930s, was stylish and it was youthful and it had a sort of spice of danger and it was a way to resist colonial rule. And if you're trying to work out how to glue a disparate country like Indonesia together, it was a way to kind of imagine you could build a new society. Or if you're an Indian nationalist, kind of try and recover a sense of cultural confidence after so many years of being told that everything civilized and sort of technologically sophisticated was from Britain, not from India. So help us understand this kind of interwar moment just before the Japanese start invading their neighbors, the role of nationalism and how it was focused on the desire to be rid of the European empires.
So I think that you put it very, very nicely and very well indeed, and thank you for that. I think that nationalism and all these other movements that are sort of floating about give a sense of hope. A sense of agency. We've been told until the First World War that European civilization is it, and we're not going to catch up, and our own civilizations are horrible, they go backward to tie us down, our elites are incompetent, our governments are incompetent. No. And I think these nationalisms gave that sense of hope and agency, and then these mass protests gave them the means, power, the institutional wherewithal to develop that into a serious program of rebuilding. So one of the points I make in the book too is that it's not a revival of old civilizations. It's not the story of India or China or Indonesia finding a old style of government that is superior somehow to the West and can be revived. That's not what it is. No, things really, really need to change. And most people writing then would sort of, I'm thinking about some Confucians in the 1930s who were, very much, they were real Confucians, but they also thought the only way in which we are going to make Confucianism count again, our old kinds of philosophical underpinnings count again, is by nationalizing, Confucianism. And you can see the same, the kind of rethinking that is happening in India too, where yes, we have our Hindu legacies, but only if we nationalize them. One of them actually, so in the years before the outbreak of the Second World War, you get people saying, well, actually, the Europeans have demonstrated that yes, they are technologically very powerful and the science is very great, but they have lost something. And it's that in the case of India, it's just spirituality. In the case of China, it's Confucianism. And it's building on those kinds of ideas that they recover this sense of, well, we have something that we can transform into these new nation states.
And I have to say, that's one of the moments reading your book where there's a kind of clanging gong reminding us of the present day. You have all these kind of, what is the future of democracy? We have all of these populist leaders in Europe, that kind of sense of despair that the elites don't know how to answer the anger of the masses. And, you just have to turn on the television and watch American politics to sort of start to see how, for nationalists in Asia, the idea of the West is in decline and the East is rising is a very different story. So now let's turn to the moment where Japan shows its teeth and it invades China under false pretenses with the Marco Polo incident, but then it starts. You say something which I think, I'm sure that many readers in Asia will be, up to this point, delighted by the idea that Europe is too Eurocentric and that Asia was, a very different form of World War II. But I suspect for some readers in Asia, at least, the most controversial statement you make is to note that actually quite a lot of nationalist leaders in Asia were quite pleased when the Japanese started invading their imperial masters. And so Sukarno in Indonesia was very supportive of the Japanese. There were plenty of Indian nationalists who were very supportive of the Japanese. There were Indians who deserted from the British Indian Army and joined essentially a Japanese proxy force, the Indian National Army, which eventually had 30,000 troops, I think you write.
That's right.
And in China, and this is obviously a controversial point in China, but the history is there, that the Japanese invasion in 1937 rescued the Chinese Communist Party from destruction by a much, much stronger Kuomintang. And so clearly, no one is denying that appalling, terrible things, atrocities happened in World War II as a result of Japan's invasion and occupation of its neighbors. But you remind us of the very uncomfortable but necessary history that plenty of Asian leaders, initially at least, welcomed the Japanese as a better alternative to the oppressors, whether that was the Kuomintang in China or the Dutch in Indonesia or the British in India. Help us unpack that very sort of uncomfortable observation.
Okay. Yes, you're absolutely right. And I was, when I began reading about the Japanese military across Asia, that was one of my greatest surprises too. And I've been my work has been about China, and I've been, all the Chinese stories about the horrors of the Japanese, and actually I've helped build that image and contributed to sort of the research on the Nanjing massacre and so on. And then I read a Dutch book which really struck me. It's one of the great Dutch histories of the Second World War, where it's very clear that when the Japanese invaded Sukarno, when the Japanese invaded Indonesia, they were welcomed. No doubt about it. People lined the roads. Now that's kind of common, but Sukarno met them, and I was like, how do you explain that? Because the Indonesian intellectuals were certainly well informed. They had been writing about the Japanese in China. So how do you explain that? And I think that's prompted me to begin rethinking this. And I think we need to think more subtly about the Japanese during. That there were all these massacres, yes, that in the end it was really awful, also true, but there were also sort of, periods when the Indonesians were genuinely happy, and there was sort of a honeymoon period, and, people started wearing kimonos in Jakarta then. So these things are all true. And I think even in the case of China, well, let me put it this way. So I teach a class on the Second World War at Peking University. And my students think exactly as you said, they know, that's exactly it. And then I have them read about Subhash Chandra Bose, who was the leader.
The Indian nationalist leader.
Yeah, Indian National Army leader. And he became sort of this very manly, masculine leader. And he's still now regarded as a hero in India itself. And the reason is that he stood up, he was willing to sacrifice his life to free India, to liberate India with the help.
But just to spell it out for people watching, the Indian National Army was an anti-British, pro-Japanese, Japanese-funded army of people who had deserted from British Indian military service. And at the end of the Second World War, the British put some of them on trial for treason.
That's right.
So this is really dark stuff, right?
It is dark stuff. And the trial is very interesting because you get these intense legal debates of, well, what really is a traitor? Who is somebody? The Indian National Army was made up of POWs after the fall of Singapore, and of course others. So then what is the legal status of the POWs? Do they have to be loyal to the king or the emperor?
So these are Indian troops who've ended up prisoners of the Japanese because they were part of a British-run force that is captured at the fall of Singapore. And then they transfer their allegiance to the anti-British cause. Is that the basic?
I don't think they want Japan to take over, but they are willing to use, they're very happy to use, they are grateful for the opportunity the Japanese is giving them to actually liberate India from British colonizers, imperialists. And so in those trials, as in the book, in those trials, actually, India rises up against the British because they say, no, these people were willing to sacrifice themselves for our cause. In some ways, as opposed to the Indian Army of the British, who had been supporting the British Empire, who had suppressed a mass uprising in 1942 during the Second World War, who had caused or helped cause the Bengal famine, and so on. And so in my class in Beijing, I have my students read about this, and they find it wonderfully interesting, and it makes them think very differently about the Japanese, and especially about Wang Jingwei, the guy who was the number 2 in the nationalists, who then went on a peace campaign, again, to find some way to escape from this war and work with the Japanese. And of course, Sukarno is I think, the clearest example of this. He welcomed the Japanese and his secular nationalists, Muhammad Hatta, his number 2, and they worked very closely. And I think it was very important for the nation state that emerged of Indonesia, that emerged out of the Second World War, because that allowed the secular nationalists who had been in prison camps under the Dutch, it allowed them to gain 2 things, I think. One is the simple administrative experience of running a very large country. Now that's invaluable. But the Japanese also gave them the opportunity to use the radio, to use publications, so they became famous. There was, of course, limits to what they could say against Japan, but they used it, and they became very much famous across Indonesia and probably further. And of course, then too, if you compare the degree to which the British were willing to give in to Indian demands for at least dominion status during the Second World War, which was 0, which was simply denied, or the degree to which the Japanese, yes, by force of circumstance, to accommodate Indonesian nationalism, you can see why the Japanese are quite welcomed. And just to remind our listeners, the negotiations between Sukarno and the Japanese had reached such a point that they were about to declare independence, and they actually did so 2 days after Japan's surrender. And many Japanese then gave them the arms to fight against the Dutch and so on. So, and I think this it's an open question to me. We are accustomed to this highly nationalistic view of Japan in China today, and we all know how that is fed through research, but more subtle, but also in the media and so on. And I think the reality where people like Wang Jingwei probably much greater support, certainly locally in Nanjing, where he did much good to relieve local suffering, and probably more broadly as well.
It's fascinating, and we'll go to questions from online users. So please start posting your questions in the chat. But I guess it's so interesting if you look at some of the recent Chinese sort of official propaganda. For example, we've seen a film that came out last year, which is a kind of semi-documentary, semi-fiction film about quite an obscure incident involving British prisoners of war on a Japanese troop ship. The ship is torpedoed. They're rescued by Chinese sailors, Chinese fishermen. And so the whole idea is that there was a kind of a fight of the good people, the British, the Chinese, against the bad people, the Japanese, the German Nazis. And it was all sort of seamless. Right. And that Asia was the victim of fascist imperialism. And that this is one of the reasons, if you look at the way that the Chinese use the American veterans of the American volunteer pilots who fought in World War II, and now their children and grandchildren get welcomed for propaganda tours, and they have the whole kind of all of that kind of push that the Chinese and the Allies were on the same side against the wicked Japanese. But you're reminding us that real life, real history is a lot messier and a lot fuzzier. So I guess before we go to users' questions, let's end with the kind of that moment at the end of World War II where the Dutch, your own country, sort of hoped, at least, I don't know if they assumed, that they would get their empire back. The French certainly intended to get their empire back. The British, very interesting, you make the point that the actual Viceroy of India, Lord Wavell, understood that something big was going to have to change, but Churchill, absolutely adamant that nothing was going to change at the end of World War II. The Americans playing this extremely ambiguous role, because, of course, the Americans liked to think of themselves as critics of empire, critics of colonialism, standing on the side of liberation, pushing Churchill to agree to end empire once the war was over, but a bit half-hearted. And so we get to this moment. The Japanese have just been defeated. It's the surrender of Japan. The empires think they're coming back. The Dutch think they're getting Indonesia back. How does that play out?
Right. Well, that's what is wonderful moment in.
下一餐估计我想去吃拉面。
你想等一会儿好。So one aspect that I found really interesting in doing this research is to explain the American story in this, and of course it seizes control of the Pacific, which itself is a very important story with real relevance, I think, for today. But I think early on, Roosevelt was confronted with this conflict, this contradiction between supporting the British, which have a huge empire, enormous resources, great army, great navy, great air force. They needed to defeat Germany, so they think that's essential. But in August 1941, during the Atlantic Charter, they had also promised self-determination. So Roosevelt believed that empire actually was a cause of the Second World War. So we need to move that. We moved beyond that. But then in the reality of power, he has to side with the British. And he does so first in 1942 during the Quit India uprising, which was a massive uprising.
In the middle of World War II, and there's an uprising in India tying up British military forces. And right. FDR has to choose between his kind of principles and helping Britain out in a very tough spot.
Yeah. And so he after a long debate and trying to push Churchill to give in to these demands, well, in the end. And one of the interesting, I found writing this chapter very interesting, because you have Chiang Kai-shek and Roosevelt and Churchill sending telegrams to each other. And Chiang Kai-shek is pushing Roosevelt. He knows that Churchill will listen to him. He's pushing Roosevelt to give in to demands of the Indian National Congress. But by the end of the Second World War, the American assessment is that, at least for now, we have to restore empire. And it is a very sudden movement. I think in the weeks before the Japanese surrender, the Americans take away areas where China was going to accept a surrender. They had been responsible for at least part of Indonesia, but all that is allocated to Mountbatten. No doubt in the knowledge that what the British would do is to revive the French and the Dutch empires. And I think the argument is that, well, for now at least, we need to do this. But
and then you get into the Cold War and the fight against communism, and America takes a very different view. I'm keen. I could talk to you for hours and hours, but we have all these people online offering brilliant questions. Now, I can either read them to you. Actually, if you press the chat button, Hans, you'll see we have already two very good questions. So the top one came in from Anthony Flynn. Can you see that one? 1343. It's exactly on what we're talking about. If you press the chat tab at the bottom of your screen.
I am pressing it. I have a very slow.
This will pop up. So let me start reading it for people who don't want to press the tab. So Anthony Flynn jumps right in on this question of the collapse of the European colonial empires. So if Japan had never invaded China in 1937, would the European colonial empires in Asia still have collapsed as quickly as they did after 1945? Or was there something about Japan, even though it eventually lost, that Japan's invasion destroyed the prestige and the legitimacy of European imperial rule?
Yes, and I sort of one point I make in the book is that one of the outcomes of all this could well have been a continuation of European empires, perhaps in a very different way. And certainly there were voices in Indonesia. Sultan Shahrir is a very good case in point. I thought, well, actually the Dutch and Indonesia need to collaborate, but in a very different kind of political framework in which there's much greater autonomy, agency, and so on, independent to Indonesia. And I think so we can't just rule out all those possibilities. And certainly the British, the French, and so on were convinced that they would revive their empire. I think, as you say, Anthony, in your question, I think the real impact of the Japanese attack, the Japanese attempt to build this new empire through military, is that they really demonstrate that the Europeans are not the great warrior races that they have assumed until then. It is that reputation for invincibility, for military prowess, that is just destroyed by the fall of Singapore, where the British surrender. The British surrender 80,000 troops to a small Japanese force, well, small 30,000 troops. The Americans did the same in the Philippines. Much less talked about is that the Dutch did the same, also 80,000 Allied troops, mostly Dutch in this case, to the Japanese. And from a military history perspective, the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia is enormously successful. It's one of the greatest military operations ever conducted. You see in the archives, you see British intelligence looking at this and saying, well, how did they do this? What kind of machines do they have? We are years away from being able to do anything like it. Because all these islands, all in Southeast Asia, you have to have all these amphibious operations. Nothing is as difficult anymore as amphibious operations, at least at the time. Satellites would be part of it, no doubt. And the Japanese were just simply extremely good at it. So it's that they just demonstrate that this idea that you can't win against these Europeans, that's over. And
so the sight of white men in a prisoner of war camp is just an extraordinary blow to kind of empire. Let's jump to the next question from Professor John Olbrich, who says, what about the Japanese invasion of the Philippines? Were they the only country not to want freedom as an American colony?
I don't know much less about the Philippines. And it's sort of one of those problems in writing a book like this. You have to skip a number of things. And I didn't talk much about Korea. I had a discussion with a Sikh podcast person saying, I should have talked about the podcast. We should talk more about the Sikhs, which is absolutely true. I can say I should have written much more about Sumatra and should have written much more about the Philippines. So I don't know very much about the Philippines. I think No, go on. I think the Philippines is part of the story because it really does draw the Americans in, because they have this commitment to the Philippines, and that's why Hawaii is important, and the Pacific supply lines and all of that. As far as I understand, in the Philippines there was a more ambiguous deal where the local Philippines did make deals with the Japanese, but also were in the end not as willing to go as far as, for instance, Sukarno did or Subhas did. So it's a more complicated story. That's not a good answer, and I apologize.
No, it's a great answer. So we have a question from Carsten about China. How has politics and society in China changed due to the war, and how did that impact the post-war political landscape of the nation? So, in hindsight, were there pre-war policies?
Yeah. But I think David already hinted at this, and more than it is spelled out. Without the Second World War in China, the communists would have gone nowhere. And Mao Zedong recognized this when he had Japanese statesmen visiting in the 1950s. Mao thanked them for invading China, because otherwise the communists would still be in the hills, probably would have starved to death. So again, these are the Second World War. There's lots of developments you could not have predicted. Nobody would have predicted.
That's amazing. If the same point were made by a Chinese historian that Mao Zedong made in the 1950s, they'd be charged with historical nihilism and they'd probably lose their job, right? But Mao gets to break rules, I guess.
I'm afraid I have been charged with that, but there you go. But my colleagues do not fully agree when it's not a problem. And I think so. The demise of the nationalists is very much connected to the Second World War. I mean, they were condemned to fight a highly modernized, an industrialized country with some of the best armed forces in the world, from a very weak position in a society that remained hugely underdeveloped, that was still struggling with famines and limited education, limited infrastructure, and so on. And I think one of the things that I really hope the book brings out is that to fight this kind of very modern war in such poor conditions is the cause of enormous suffering throughout Asia, not just China, but also. And I talk a little bit of famines of Henan, of course, and of Java and of Bengal. I think there were many more famines, because these three were used later for political purposes. And it's that reality that it just really does make you cry. It's just so horrible. And that gets you to sort of, this is not just about women. It's unimaginable how awful that the suffering was. Let me make one point about this, because my parents went through famine in the Netherlands at the end of 1945. And at that point, the differences between the Asian situation and Dutch is not very great. And one of the things I really do try, one of the things I hope I can do, is to sort of move us away from a victor-centric war. Because the war is kind of easy, right? If you live it's not easy, but it's not as bad as it was in Asian parts of, certainly Eastern Europe and then later parts of Western Europe. And I've always, as they say, in the United States, living standards went up. In the UK, yes, there was rationing, and therefore people had less to eat, but their health declined. Their health improved because they eat less. But of course, in Asia, it was all hard. And in talking about the Second World War, which I've done for decades, I often find it quite easier, instinctively, to talk with descendants of parents who have gone through similar things than to, certainly in America, actually, where this kind of, this very dark side of the war is just not known. And that's it. But politically, it is hugely, you wouldn't have a communist China today unless it was for the Japanese invasion.
We have a great question from Arthur Jang about Thailand, the only country in Southeast Asia that was not conquered by European empires. So did Thailand try to cooperate with Japan officially? And how did Thailand successfully shake off the fascist puppet regime accountability, Arthur says?
Good questions. And again, I just must say I don't really know enough about it. I think Thailand had the advantage of being between the various European empires. It also didn't really have the resources that these empires were after. And I think the elites were extremely capable of signaling to all sides that they were willing to stay neutral. It's like Turkey in the Second World War, which had done some of the same things. So neutrality is as a well-developed skill, and I think that's really all I have to say about that.
So Alan, the boss of the whole show, he has a good controversial question. So, Europeans have disappeared as an imperial force across Asia. To what extent has China, including the Chinese diaspora, replaced Europeans as an empire? If you define empire as an empire of influence across Asia,
an informal empire, China's informal empire. Yes, I think there's a lot to that, and of course. It was in Bandung. I talk a little bit about this because you have the Asian diasporas that were a great concern to the new governments of Indonesia as well as of Malaya and also Thailand. And that Zhou Enlai actually makes the really interesting gesture to these governments, saying, "Look, we are not going to mobilize them. We're not going to do that. In return, you don't side with the Americans." I think that's kind of an understood deal that was developed there. But today, of course, China is doing exactly what the British Empire was doing. They're trying to build the kinds of trade routes, supply lines, transport lines that it needs for its markets. And they will also try to militarily protect them. We're seeing that, of course. So I think there are similarities there. And Alan, I have my students at Peking University, well, some of them, the PhD students, write essays comparing the British Empire and its construction of these trade networks and what China is doing today. And they see the point just as well as we do.
It's a fascinating thing, isn't it? So much of the imperial history in Asia was these kind of private companies that then morphed into kind of governmental companies. But it was kind of armed merchants, right, going out and building these networks of dependency and supply chains. There are very powerful echoes.
There are, yes, absolutely.
So we may have, I think, a last time for one more question.
Yes, Juliet.
So we have Juliet. So do you talk about Japan's influence on KMT nationalism, given the particular status of Taiwan as a colonial possession of Japan before the war and obviously during the war?
Juliet, how are you? I've seen you in my classes after all.
I'm well, thank you. Great to tune in. Thanks for the brilliant
thank you very much for coming. I think the influence of Japan on pre-1937 nationalism was probably limited. Although Sun Yat-sen famously, made alliances with everybody who was willing to give him money, including the Japanese. I think the influence grows much more strongly after 1945, because when the Chinese surrender, when the Japanese surrender in 1945, they still control China, except for communist areas and except for bits where Chiang Kai-shek is located, which is Sichuan, and really not very much of that either. So they're dependent on the Japanese. And I think, again, there are deals or understandings, because what Japan at that point decides is what it does not want is a communist China. So it is going to help the nationalists. And the nationalists know that they need Japanese support. And there are the Japanese send military and political advisors to help them fight the communists. And of course, the Japanese have learned a lot about fighting communists in North China during the war. And I think it struck me, at least, when I went to Taiwan the first time in the 1980s, there's at least the police organizations really echoed the way that the Japanese organized their police. So I think there were echoes then. They deepened probably more after 1945. Because, and yes, when I went for the first time to Taiwan in there were lots of Japanese buildings. It was very Japanesey in its way. But I think before 1945, that would have been far less. But that, not to say, of course, that much of both the KMT and the CCP military are trained or have experience of being trained at Japanese-run military academies. So there is that. It's a good point. I think much more could be said.
Thank you. Thank you. We're right up against time, and I think there are still so many unanswered questions, and clearly the only solution is for people to go and buy your book and read it. And just such a powerful reminder that the world, it's very easy for propaganda to turn things into them and us, good and bad, simple narratives. But you have reminded us that history looks very different depending on which side of the world you are. It looks very different depending on what language you speak and read. And that real history is a lot messier than the propaganda books. So it's a fantastic exercise, and thank you very much for letting me join you all.
Thank you, David. It was great, and I wish we could continue the discussion. Hopefully, we'll have a chance in the future. But absolutely wonderful. And thanks to you all for coming. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Hans and David, for guiding a wonderful discussion. I think there are questions come up, particularly one, for example, from Melinda, that I hope, Hans, you and we can meet.
I can stay. Mr. David is busy.
Over a dinner.
He's a world to run, and I don't. But
I cannot recommend the book enough. It's a really gripping read. Fantastic, broad picture and detailed narrative are both very, very compelling. So thank you very much indeed, Hans. And thank you, David, for bringing out how brilliant the book is. Thank you again, David, enormously. Won't see you for some time. Hans, look forward to seeing you in Beijing.
We'll see you soon. Yep, absolutely.
Thank you so much.